I know that it can feel a little bit like this is inaccessible or extra biblical information, and why would we need extra biblical information to understand the Bible itself? And so, right up front, I want to be very clear that the Bible is clear, has a clear and useful message for life and godliness for us if we don't have access to historical and cultural context. But in many cases, the context that we need along both lines is actually available to us within the Bible itself. And rarely do we need to go look outside of the Bible for additional helps. Although I will just say that much of what we'll be talking about is just basic world history or cultural context that is easily available to find and that is assumed in the minds of the writers of the biblical text. It's assumed that we will know it, and it's not that hard to find. So really, when we talk about this layer of context as it relates to reading the Bible, what we're trying to do is place ourselves in the seats of the original audience as much as possible. We want to step into their world, and we want to hear the messages that the Bible is communicating the way that they would have been received by that original audience. But that is no simple matter. If you have ever traveled overseas to a different culture, then you are probably aware of how it feels to step into someone else's world where all of the rules feel unfamiliar to you. I have a child who's living in Korea currently, in South Korea, and when we went over to visit her just recently, we stepped into a culture that was unfamiliar. I've traveled to Europe and England before, and there were recognizable elements of culture there. It was much less so in South Korea. This was a culture that had been heavily shaped by post-World War recovery and by the Korean War in the 60s and early 70s. And so the way that that culture functions is heavily shaped by these different waves that had hit them in really fairly recently in human history. So they're a culture that doesn't litter. Everything is very organized. They're a very child-focused culture. And it was fascinating to see how different values, different ways of thinking about the world impact the way that they function as a society. They have a much more of a sense of shared identity than we do here in the United States. And that factors into how they think about the elderly and how they think about the young. So when you step into someone else's culture, you begin to realize that not everyone is hearing things the way that you do, and that helps us understand a little about how the Bible is written. But even within our own culture, the way that words are used can change as time passes, and sometimes it doesn't even take that much time for a word to be used in a very different way than it might have been in recent years. So just for example, imagine sitting down and having a conversation with your great-grandmother where you use words like this: stream, tablet, catfish, troll, follow, like, swipe, tag, post, timeline, or viral. Those words all meant something to your great-grandmother that they don't mean to you. A tablet to your great-grandmother was something that you took when you had a headache. A catfish was something that you went and ate at a buffet on Friday night. Following was something that you did if you were a creepy person. But now all of these things have a meaning to us in a digital age that is different than the meaning that they used to have. Our own digital culture has shifted radically just in the last 20 or 30 years. So now think about the original audience for the Bible. The last books of the Bible were written around 90 AD, which means it's been pretty much a solid 2,000 years since God inspired humans to write these texts down. This means that they were written to worlds that were quite different than the world that we live in today. We're all prisoners of our own historical and cultural moment. We all only know the history and culture that we have been immersed in, or at least that's the one that we're the most familiar with. It's where all of our instincts are grounded. And so in the same way that going over to Korea or talking to your great-grandmother would impact the way that you try to navigate the way words are used or the way that relationships are formed, we have to ask, what is the impact of 2,000 years, and in some cases much more than that, having passed since these words were given to an original audience? That is the work that is before us.